Three little girls in torn dresses walked up to a billionaire at dinner and asked for a piece of bread. What he did next shocked the entire city. Have you ever wondered what it truly means to change a life with a single act of kindness? The late afternoon sun bathed the city in gold as warm rays spilled over the terrace of Lucerne Sky, one of San Francisco's most exclusive restaurants. The linen tablecloths fluttered gently in the breeze, and the soft clink of silverware from nearby tables mixed with the murmur of conversation spoken over wine and oysters. Michael Willoughby sat alone at a corner table, tucked against the glass railing that overlooked the bay. He wore a pale gray suit, crisply pressed, and a watch that cost more than most cars. Yet, despite the perfect setting and his pristine appearance, there was something distant in his posture, a kind of quiet sorrow behind his eyes that the world had long stopped noticing. He hadn't ordered much yet. Only bread had arrived, still warm from the oven, resting in a basket lined with white cloth. The utensils lay neatly arranged, untouched. He sat in silence, elbows on the table, fingers gently touching, staring blankly at the waves in the distance, lost in a place no one else could see. Most people at the restaurant recognized him, or at least knew of him, the tech magnate, the philanthropist, the man who'd once been called the heart of Silicon Valley. But lately, he'd become known for something else. His silence, his retreat, his absence from his own world. Just as he reached for a piece of bread, something interrupted his stillness. The sound of small footsteps, hesitant but determined, came from behind. He turned slowly and saw three little girls standing just a few feet from his table. They looked to be about 5 years old, triplets perhaps, or very close in age. All three had golden blonde hair falling in soft waves to their shoulders and large searching blue eyes. They wore light dresses in pastel colors, one blue, one pink, one yellow, slightly wrinkled with scuffed shoes that didn't quite match. The tallest of the three, though only by an inch or so, took a half step forward. Their voices came as one, soft but clear, a strange harmony that broke the luxury restaurant's polished calm. "Sir, may we have a piece of your bread?" Michael blinked, startled at first. He looked around. No adults. No one seemed to notice them, or if they did, they turned their eyes away. Something inside him stirred. He looked down at the basket in front of him, then back at the girls. He could see the edges of dirt on their knees, their small hands clasped in front of them, not begging exactly, but hoping. His throat tightened, and he didn't understand why at first. 1,000 thoughts came at once. The sharpness of their question, the softness of their eyes, the quiet way they waited, as if they were used to being turned down. He leaned in slightly, voice low. "Why are you hungry?" There was silence between them for a moment. Then the girl in the yellow dress, Emma, though he didn't know her name yet, spoke, her voice thin and steady. "Our mom got taken away by an ambulance. They tried to send us back to our dad, but he heard her. He heard us, too." Michael felt something drop inside his chest, "so we ran away," added the girl in blue. "They said we had to go to a place, but it wasn't safe there." "Not really. No one wanted us. And we haven't eaten today," whispered the one in pink. She looked down as she said it, almost ashamed. Michael reached for his napkin, though not to use it. He just needed something to hold. A tear had formed at the corner of his eye, unexpected and unwelcome. He blinked quickly, turning his face slightly toward the bay. He had no idea why they had come to him. Of all the tables, all the people, why his? Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe on some invisible level, they recognized something in him that matched something in themselves. Could this moment be the turning point for a man who had everything but felt so empty? Without saying another word, he stood up from the table and pulled out 3 chairs. "Come, sit down," he said quietly. They looked at each other, uncertain, as if waiting for permission from a world that rarely gave it. Then slowly, all 3 climbed into the chairs. He passed the bread basket across the table. They didn't attack it. They each took a small piece, politely, almost ceremoniously, breaking off tiny bites as if afraid to take too much. It broke his heart. And as he watched them eat, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Something warm, painful, and deeply human. It was the moment everything changed. Though he couldn't have known it yet, the life of Michael Willoughby, the billionaire, the genius, the man alone, had just cracked open. Not because of business or success or failure, but because 3 little girls asked for bread. Get ready to discover how this simple request transformed a millionaire's life forever, only on Millionaire in Love. The restaurant was nearly empty by the time the girls had finished eating. The sky had deepened to a dusky violet, and the first city lights began to flicker on across the bay like tiny stars. Michael hadn't moved much from his seat except to ask the staff for water and later something more substantial for the children. Soup, fruit, and warm milk. They had eaten quietly, thanking him each time a dish was placed in front of them, their manners oddly precise for children so young. There was a kind of sadness to their politeness, a sense that they had learned very early what it meant to need something and not be allowed to ask for it. Michael sat back in his chair, observing them, trying to understand what was happening inside him. He had given to dozens of charities over the years. He had cut 7-figure checks to shelters and hospitals. He had built orphanages in Eastern Europe and sent scholarships to kids in war zones. But never before had something struck him the way this had. It wasn't charity now. It wasn't a mission. It was something personal, something raw and immediate, like looking into a mirror that showed him not who he was, but who he had once been. He asked their names gently, not wanting to pressure them. The one in the pink dress, who had seemed the surest at first, said she was Lily. The girl in blue, bolder, and with a quiet fire in her eyes, said her name was Scarlett. And the smallest of the 3, the one in the yellow dress, who had barely spoken until now, simply whispered, Emma. He repeated their names aloud, softly, and they looked at him with something that was not yet trust, but the beginning of it. As the night deepened, he couldn't bring himself to leave them. The idea of walking away from the table from these girls who had shown up in his life like ghosts from another life felt unbearable. He remembered being 7 years old, sitting on a cold front porch in Detroit, waiting for a mother who wouldn't come back and a father who came home angry and loud. He remembered nights in foster care, sleeping with his shoes on just in case he needed to run. No one had stopped on the street back then. No one had offered him bread. He made a decision without realizing it was one. He called his assistant Sarah and told her to cancel the next 2 days' meetings. Then he contacted his lawyer, waking him up and telling him to prepare emergency paperwork for temporary guardianship. His tone was sharp, focused. He wasn't asking. Then he called the restaurant manager, asked for the private lounge to be opened, and arranged for a driver to bring blankets and clothes from one of the department stores he'd invested in. Back at the table, the girls were beginning to fade, their heads nodding as fatigue overtook hunger. Scarlett tried to fight it, blinking rapidly and sitting upright as if worried sleep would somehow make this safety disappear. Emma had already curled up against the back of the chair, her thumb in her mouth, eyes closed. Lily kept looking at Michael as if he might vanish if she blinked too long. He leaned forward and spoke softly, as if he were trying not to disturb a sleeping animal. "You're safe here. I promise." Scarlett's voice was no louder than a breath. "Are you going to take us back?" He hesitated. "Back where?" he said. Michael's hands tensed under the table and he forced himself to relax. "No," he said, voice steady. "I'll never take you anywhere unsafe." The words felt like a vow, the kind that binds deeper than contracts or courts. When the blankets arrived, he wrapped each of them himself. Lily accepted his help like a child used to being responsible for others. Scarlett hesitated, then let him tuck the edges around her. Emma stirred, but didn't wake. He carried her gently into the lounge, where a couch had been cleared and turned into a makeshift bed. He didn't let the staff touch them. For the first time in years, Michael felt something stronger than duty. He felt like he belonged somewhere. Not to a company or a foundation or a cause, but to these 3 small people who had walked into his life with nothing but the courage to ask for a piece of bread. He sat in the dark beside them for a long time after they'd fallen asleep, watching the soft rise and fall of their chests. His mind wasn't on his fortune or the headlines or his reputation. It was on their future. And he knew without doubt that whatever it took, money, time, war with the system, he would do it because something had opened inside him that he had locked away for decades, and it was no longer possible to close it again. Morning light crept gently through the tall windows of Michael's penthouse apartment, spilling across polished wooden floors and soft rugs in shades of ivory and gray. The scent of brewing coffee mixed faintly with the citrusy air from the fresh bouquet his housekeeper had arranged the day before. It was the kind of morning meant to be quiet, calm, and controlled, like most of his mornings used to be. But today was different. Today, the silence was interrupted by 3 sets of tiny footsteps, hesitant and uneven, as if the world beneath them might disappear if they weren't careful. Lily was the first to awake, padding softly through the hallway in a borrowed cotton nightgown that reached her ankles. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Michael with a gaze that held both curiosity and caution. He was standing by the stove, sleeves rolled up, trying and slightly failing to scramble eggs. When he noticed her, he smiled. It wasn't the polished smile he gave during interviews or board meetings. It was crooked, uncertain, and human. Lily didn't say anything. She walked to the island counter, sat on one of the tall chairs, and waited. A few minutes later, Scarlett joined them, her blonde hair tangled and her eyes alert. Emma, as usual, was last. She came in rubbing her eyes, clutching a stuffed rabbit Michael's assistant had brought over late last night. He didn't know how to talk to children. Not really. He had given millions to child welfare programs, but had never spent more than 5 minutes with a child in his life. Still, when he served their breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast with jam, and warm milk, he placed each plate in front of them with care, as if it were an offering. They ate in silence at first. Then Scarlett asked if this was his house, and Lily followed with a question about the elevator. Emma said nothing, but she watched him with such intensity it felt like she was reading a story he hadn't written yet. After breakfast, he made phone calls, a lot of them. He spoke to a child psychologist, a family lawyer, and 2 private investigators. He learned the girl's last name, Jenkins, and pulled every record he could find. What emerged was worse than he expected. Their father, Carl Jenkins, had a history of domestic violence that stretched back almost a decade. There were restraining orders, hospital records, police calls, and testimonies from neighbors. The girl's mother, Haley, had been taken to the emergency room in critical condition 2 days ago. She was alive, but in a medically induced coma. She had no family nearby. Child Protective Services had placed the girls in a group home temporarily, but they had gone missing from it sometime the night before. No one had reported them found. Michael stared at the report in disbelief. How was it possible that 3 children could disappear and no one noticed? No one searched. No one seemed to care. His lawyer told him firmly but carefully that taking custody wouldn't be easy. He was not a relative. The girls had not been officially placed in foster care. And Michael, despite his money and influence, was not above the law. But he didn't flinch. He told the lawyer to prepare for the fight anyway. Temporary guardianship, emergency custody hearings, background checks, psychological evaluations, whatever it took. Meanwhile, in the apartment, life had already begun to shift around them. Michael's staff adapted quickly. His assistant Sarah arranged for a pediatrician to visit the apartment that afternoon. His housekeeper added children's clothes, blankets, and art supplies to her shopping list. His driver installed booster seats in the back of the black SUV. What had once been a pristine, silent, curated home began to fill with noise, blocks tumbling to the floor, music from old cartoons, and giggles echoing off high ceilings. But beneath the laughter, there was still something fragile. Emma refused to speak, even when addressed directly. Scarlett flinched at sudden movements. Lily kept offering to help clean up after meals, as though she had learned not to take care for granted. Michael watched all of it and stored it away in a quiet part of his mind. He didn't push them. He didn't ask for stories. He simply made space for them to exist, to breathe, to feel whatever they were feeling without pressure. Each night, he read to them. The first book was Charlotte's Web. He hadn't read it since he was 10, but the girls sat in a line on the sofa, heads tilted, completely silent, listening as he stumbled over the voices of farm animals. Emma curled up next to him by the 2nd chapter. Scarlett rested her head on his shoulder by the 4th. And Lily, sitting between them, didn't say anything, but she didn't let go of his sleeve either. He wasn't trying to be their father. He didn't know what he was. A protector. A pause in the storm. A stranger who said yes when the rest of the world said no. He only knew one thing for certain. Something had changed. Not just in the apartment or in their lives, but in his. For the first time in years, Michael didn't feel like he was trying to fix the world with a checkbook. He wasn't fixing anything. He was simply staying, being there. And somehow that felt harder and more important than anything else he had ever done. It was nearly 2 months after the girls had first come into his life when the call came just after noon on a rainy Wednesday. Michael had been in the middle of reviewing architectural designs for a new shelter his foundation was funding when his assistant knocked once, then stepped inside without waiting for a response, something she never did unless it was serious. Her eyes said everything before she even spoke. The mother, Haley Jenkins, had regained consciousness. Michael stood frozen for a moment, the sketches in his hand slipping to the table unnoticed. He had read her medical updates each week, tracked her condition quietly without telling the girls anything they weren't ready to hear. The trauma she had endured was severe. Internal injuries, broken ribs, a fractured skull. The doctors weren't sure she would survive the first night, let alone recover enough to wake, but now she had. Awake, alert, speaking, asking questions. He arrived at the hospital within the hour. He took the back in trance, escorted by private security, and was led to the ICU wing where she lay in a sterile white bed, thin and pale, with N4 in one arm and monitors quietly blinking behind her. For a moment, as he stood in the doorway, he couldn't bring himself to speak. He had pictured her many times, sometimes broken, sometimes whole, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of the woman who had given life to the 3 children who were now asleep each night under his roof. She looked up slowly when he entered. Her eyes were the same bright piercing blue as her daughter's. Despite everything, they were sharp with awareness, not dulled by medication or confusion. She didn't ask who he was. Instead, in a voice raspy and thin, but steady, she asked, "Where are my girls?" Michael sat beside her bed, pulling the chair forward. He didn't offer pleasantries or ease into the conversation. There was no point. He leaned forward and spoke gently but clearly. "They're safe. They're with me. I've been taking care of them." He told her everything. How they had found him at the restaurant. How they had been living with him since that night. How they were eating well, sleeping better, and beginning just barely to smile again. He didn't say too much. He didn't tell her about Emma's silence or the way Scarlett still double-checked the locks on the doors before bed. He didn't tell her how Lily had started copying his habits, mimicking the way he folded napkins or checked the stove, as if testing what safety looked like. He only told her what she needed to know, that they were loved and they were safe. Tears ran down her cheeks as she listened. She didn't try to wipe them away. Her body was still too weak to lift both arms. "I thought they were gone," she whispered. "I thought after what happened that I'd never see them again." "You will," Michael said. "When you're ready. When the doctors say it's safe for you to have visitors, and when the court allows it, I'll bring them." She turned her face slightly toward the window, the rain still streaking down the glass. "I ran from him for so long. I stayed for too long. I thought I could protect them, but it was never enough." And then she stopped, her voice breaking under the weight of it. Michael didn't respond with empty reassurances. He didn't tell her she had done her best or that it wasn't her fault. He simply reached out and rested his hand lightly on the edge of the blanket. She didn't pull away. That was enough. When he returned home that evening, he sat in the girls' playroom while they built a city out of blocks. They didn't ask where he had been. But when he told them their mother had woken up, the air in the room changed instantly. Lily dropped the block in her hand. Scarlett's eyes filled, but she blinked fast and didn't let the tears fall. Emma didn't say anything, of course, but she crawled into his lap and buried her face in his shirt. He told them gently that it would take time, that their mom was still very sick, but she was awake and she had asked about them. He said she missed them, that she loved them. That night, they all asked to sleep in the same room. He agreed without hesitation, helping them carry pillows and blankets into the guest bedroom where they had sometimes napped together. He tucked each of them in. And as he turned to leave, Lily called out to him softly. "Will you stay, too? Just until we fall asleep." He sat in the armchair by the window, watching the rise and fall of their small breaths, the way children always seem peaceful in sleep, even when their waking hours are heavy with memory. He knew the road ahead would be long. There would be legal challenges, hearings, therapists, custody evaluations, and 100 difficult questions. But for now, there was only this. A woman had opened her eyes and remembered her daughters. 3 little girls had held on to each other long enough to be found. And somewhere in between, a man who had believed he was finished with life had found something that made him begin again. The court hearing took place on a gray morning that seemed to echo the tension weighing in the air. The girls weren't present, of course. Michael had arranged for them to spend the day at home with Sarah and the child psychologist they had begun to trust. They didn't know what a courtroom was. Not really. And Michael wasn't going to make them sit through hours of discussion about their past, about people who had failed them, or about things they had no control over. But he knew that what happened that day would shape their future more than anything else had since they escaped that group home and asked him for a piece of bread. Michael sat at the long oak table with his legal team. Across the room sat a man whose name he had only read on paper until now. Carl Jenkins, the girl's biological father. In person, he looked both familiar and forgettable. Average build, thinning hair, an expensive suit that didn't quite fit right, and a smugness that settled around his mouth like something he couldn't hide. He looked like someone who had been warned to appear calm, rehearsed to appear reformed, but the darkness behind his eyes hadn't changed. The attorneys spoke for hours. Witnesses were called. Medical records reviewed. Police reports read aloud. There were photos. Haley's bruised face, hospital x-rays, emergency room logs, the written statements from neighbors and friends. Michael watched as Carl sat motionless through it all, occasionally adjusting his cufflinks, occasionally glancing at the judge like a man who still believed power came from posture. When he finally spoke, his words were polished and careful. He talked about second chances, about how he had started anger management, about the stress of losing his job, the strain of fatherhood. Not once did he mention his daughters by name. Not once did he ask where they were or if they were okay. Haley was brought into the courtroom in a wheelchair. Her recovery was still incomplete, but she insisted on being there. She looked small and pale, but her voice didn't shake. She told the truth even when it hurt. She described the abuse, the fear, the countless times she thought about leaving, but didn't know how. She admitted that she hadn't protected the girls the way she wished she had, but she had tried. And when she saw the chance to escape, she took it. That, she said, was the only thing she didn't regret. The judge listened without expression. His eyes moved from one person to another, nodding occasionally, taking notes. Michael had been in hundreds of meetings, faced investors, CEOs, boardrooms filled with cynics and doubters, but nothing compared to the stillness of that room. Every word was heavy, every silence louder than any outburst. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood, not with prepared notes or a rehearsed statement, but with the truth. He explained what had happened the night the girls approached him. He described how they had been living since then, not as charity, not as guests, but as something closer to family. He didn't claim to be a perfect guardian. He didn't claim to know what he was doing half the time. But he told them how he made sure they were safe. How they laughed sometimes now. How Emma had finally started to hum songs in the back seat. How Lily had learned to make grilled cheese sandwiches and now insisted on cooking for her sisters every Friday. How Scarlett had started reading chapter books out loud, correcting him whenever he skipped a word. He didn't ask for custody in that moment. He didn't try to take them. He simply said he wouldn't walk away from them, that he had made a promise, and that he intended to keep it. When the judge gave his ruling, the courtroom went completely silent. The biological father, Carl Jenkins, was permanently stripped of all parental rights due to clear and repeated evidence of abuse, negligence, and criminal behavior. Haley Jenkins retained her parental rights, but with the condition that any custody be evaluated again in 6 months pending her physical and psychological recovery. Until then, full temporary custody was granted to Michael Willoughby with continued court supervision and the option for adoption if deemed appropriate. Haley sat quietly, her hands in her lap. When Michael turned toward her, unsure what she would say, she looked at him with tears in her eyes and spoke softly, almost like she was afraid to break something fragile. "I'm not giving up on them," she said. "But I can't do it alone. Not yet." Michael didn't hesitate. He moved to her side, knelt slightly beside her chair, and looked her in the eye. "You won't have to," he said. "We'll do this together." No one spoke after that for a long time. The judge gave a final nod and closed the file. Lawyers gathered papers. The bailiff opened the door. Outside, the rain had stopped and light was beginning to filter through the clouds. It was not the end of the story. It wasn't even the beginning of the end, but it was a doorway, a choice made, a direction set. That evening, when Michael returned home, the girls were waiting in the foyer as if they'd known. Lily ran to him first, wrapping her arms around his waist. Scarlett followed, asking quietly, "Is it over?" And Emma, as always, didn't speak, but she took his hand and didn't let go for the rest of the night. Something permanent had shifted, not just in court records or legal files, but in hearts and trust and belief. And for the first time all of them began to believe that this fragile little world they had built might not fall apart after all. Summer came slowly that year, soft and golden with long evenings and the sound of cicadas weaving through the silence. Life in Michael's home had settled into something that almost resembled normal, though it had not come easily. The girls had formed rhythms, familiar ones, who liked which cereal, what music played during cleanup time, the unspoken rule that Emma only brushed her teeth if Lily helped her. They had their own rooms now, decorated in soft tones with bookshelves, fairy lights, and handmade drawings taped to the walls. They had favorite forks, favorite bedtime stories, and a secret hiding place behind the couch where Michael often pretended not to find them. But beneath it all, there was still a quiet, unspoken wound. One that showed itself in small moments. The flinch at a slammed door. The way Scarlett watched the hallway before she slept. The way Lily still woke up sometimes just to check that the others were breathing. And then there was Emma. Emma had not spoken since the night they met. Not one word, not even a whisper in sleep. At first, Michael assumed it was trauma, and the therapist confirmed it. Selective mutism, they called it, rooted in fear and emotional overload. She had the ability to speak, but her voice remained locked behind something deeper than silence. Michael tried not to force it. He learned to understand her without words. The tilt of her head, the way she tugged on his sleeve when she wanted something, the little gestures she used with her sisters. But there was always a question that lived quietly in his chest. Would she ever speak again? One evening, not long after the court ruling, they drove to the coast. Michael had promised them a trip to see the ocean, and after the long tension of the past months, he needed it just as much as they did. The drive was quiet, peaceful. Scarlett read a book aloud in the back seat, while Lily helped navigate with a paper map he had printed out just to make her feel important. Emma sat beside him up front, holding the stuffed rabbit that had been her constant companion since that first night. She looked out the window, her eyes wide, her mouth closed. When they arrived, the girls ran toward the shore, shoes forgotten, squealing as the cold water touched their toes. Michael stood back for a while, watching, his hands in his pockets. The wind tousled his hair, and the salt in the air reminded him of a childhood he had worked hard to forget. But here now, it didn't hurt as much. Not with them laughing in the surf. Eventually, Emma wandered back toward him. She wasn't wet like the others. She had watched, but not joined, her eyes full of questions she hadn't yet learned how to ask. She walked right up to him and reached for his hand, small fingers curling into his. He looked down and gave it a gentle squeeze. They sat together on a log at the edge of the beach, the sky melting into orange and lavender. The waves rolled in quietly, and gulls cried in the distance. Emma rested her head against his arm and said nothing. He didn't speak either. There was no need. Minutes passed like that. Then very softly, so quietly he almost thought he imagined it, she whispered, "You're not going to leave, are you?" Michael turned to her, startled, heart thudding in his chest. She looked up at him with wide, uncertain eyes, as if unsure she had really spoken or whether she should have. He knelt in the sand beside her, his voice barely above a breath. "No," he said. I'm not going anywhere. Emma's lower lip trembled. She nodded once, then leaned forward and wrapped her arms around his neck. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't let go for a long time. From that day on, something in her shifted. She didn't begin speaking full sentences overnight. It came in fragments, shy and cautious, like a bird testing the air after being caged too long. One morning she said pancakes at breakfast. The next week she sang the last line of a lullaby with Lily. She began asking short questions, always directed at Michael first. Where are we going? Can I help? Will you read tonight? The house began to change too. There was more laughter now, louder footsteps, less hesitation. The fear that had once lived in the corners began to dissolve under the weight of consistency. The girls started calling it home. Not the house, not your place, just home. One night, Scarlett corrected a visitor who referred to Michael as the man taking care of them. She stood up straight, crossed her arms, and declared, "That's our dad." Michael had never asked for that title. He had never pushed it. But when he heard it, something cracked open in him. Something buried deep. He smiled and looked at Emma, who simply nodded once and whispered, "Daddy." It was the only time he cried in front of them. Not because he was sad, not because he was afraid, but because sometimes healing arrives quietly, like a whisper on a beach at sunset, and all you can do is hold it close and not let go. Autumn came softly with gold leaf trees lining the driveway and a light chill in the air that signaled a season of change. Inside the house, however, warmth had settled in like a permanent guest. The girls had been living with Michael for over a year now, and what once felt like a temporary arrangement had become something deeply rooted. The house had adapted to them entirely. There were coats hung on lower hooks for smaller arms, shoes scattered near the doorway in mismatched pairs, and drawings taped to the refrigerator that changed weekly, some of them signed in careful, sprawling letters. It was no longer the minimalist, pristine penthouse that once belonged to a man who lived mostly alone. It was a home now, lived in, noisy, colorful, sometimes chaotic, but filled with something he hadn't known he'd been missing. Haley had continued to heal. After her release from the hospital, she was placed in a rehabilitation center for a few months, then moved into a nearby apartment arranged by Michael's team. They had kept the arrangement quiet, not wanting to unsettle the girls while she regained strength. But slowly and steadily, she grew stronger. Her physical therapy progressed, and she began volunteering part-time at a women's shelter not far from the city, one she had once stayed in briefly before things had turned worse with Carl. There was something poetic, Michael thought, about her returning to the very system that had nearly failed her, only this time as someone stronger with the power to help others. At first she saw the girls in short supervised visits, then longer ones, a few hours in the park or small outings with Michael present nearby. The children were hesitant in the beginning, Lily most of all. She had taken on the quiet responsibility of protector, and letting someone else back in, someone who had been gone during their darkest moments, was not something she did lightly. But over time, as Haley showed up again and again, patiently, gently, without demanding more than they were ready to give, the tension began to fade. There were hugs again, timid at first, then full and trusting. There were bedtime calls, whispered goodnights over speakerphone, handwritten cards with drawings enclosed. Michael watched it all unfold with a mixture of quiet relief and deep admiration. He had expected anger. Rejection maybe. But the girls surprised him as they always did. Their resilience wasn't just in survival. It was in their capacity for forgiveness, for hope, for the courage to trust someone who had once been too broken to protect them. And Haley didn't ask for more than what they offered. She never spoke poorly of the past, never asked the girls to remember her as perfect. She told them the truth in pieces small enough for their hearts to handle and always reminded them that the strongest thing she ever did was get them away. One crisp Sunday morning in October, the family took their first trip together, just the five of them. No therapists, no aides, no supervision. Just a drive to the countryside, a pumpkin patch, a hayride, and hot cider shared on a wooden bench as the girls jumped in piles of leaves. It was simple, almost ordinary, and yet it felt monumental. Haley and Michael sat side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, watching as Lily tried to carry a pumpkin twice her size, while Scarlett instructed Emma on how to find the perfect one. Michael glanced sideways at Haley and saw tears in her eyes. Not the broken kind, but the quiet kind that come when something long hoped for begins to come true. Later that week, after the girls had gone to bed, Haley came to visit. They sat in the living room, lights dimmed, soft music playing in the background. She held a warm cup of tea, her hands steady now, her hair longer than it had been in the hospital. She looked over at Michael and smiled, a tired, genuine smile. "They're okay," she said. "I didn't think I'd ever see that." "You helped make them okay," Michael replied. "Don't forget that." There was a pause. Then she set her cup down and turned to him more fully. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what happens next. About where I fit now." Michael nodded, but said nothing. He knew what she meant. They had never defined what they were. There had been no promises, only partnership, only care. But it had deepened over time. Shared dinners, long conversations, moments of silence that felt natural instead of strained. There was no romantic theater in it. No declarations, just two people who had carried the same pain from different sides and somehow found strength in each other's presence. "I don't want to take them away from you," she continued. "They need you. They love you. They love you, too." He said, "They need both of us." Haley blinked, her eyes glistening. "Then maybe we stop pretending this is temporary." The idea of marriage had come up before, usually as a joke from Scarlett, or in the innocent way children assume adults in the same house must eventually fall in love. But now, sitting in the quiet warmth of the living room, it no longer felt like an assumption. It felt like the next honest step. Not because of tradition or pressure or fairy tale expectations, but because this was what they had built together, slowly, painfully, beautifully. So, in May, they stood under a blooming cherry tree in the backyard of the country house Michael had bought for weekends and holidays. It wasn't a grand wedding. There were no press releases, no paparazzi, no designer gowns, just 5 people, a close friend officiating, and flower petals scattered by 3 little girls in dresses of soft pink, blue, and yellow. Haley wore a simple white dress and a daisy in her hair. Michael wore the same light gray suit he'd been wearing the day they met. Scarlett read a poem. Lily cried. Emma handed them rings on a velvet cushion, smiling so wide it made Michael's chest ache. They exchanged vows with quiet voices and steady eyes. And when they kissed, gentle, warm, familiar, the girls cheered so loudly that even the birds flew from the trees. Later that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, they danced in the backyard under strings of lights. Emma rested her head on Michael's shoulder as he swayed gently with her in his arms. Scarlett and Lily twirled barefoot in the grass. Haley watched them all with the kind of peace that only comes after years of surviving the storm. And for the first time truly deeply, they were not afraid of the future because the future was already here. It was in every laugh, every promise, every quiet moment stitched into the fabric of their new life. They had built something that no one could take from them now. Not a rescue, not a recovery, a family. The hall was filled with warm light and the quiet hum of anticipation. Rows of people, many in suits, some in sweaters, sat with hands folded or cameras in their laps. Most were strangers to one another, gathered from different corners of the country. Board members, journalists, advocates, teachers, donors, shelter staff, caseworkers, people whose lives had in some way been touched by the man who was now stepping onto the stage. Michael didn't like these kinds of events. He had spent most of his career avoiding the spotlight unless absolutely necessary. But this was different. This wasn't about business or success or legacy. This was personal. This was about something far more permanent than reputation. He adjusted the microphone gently and looked out at the crowd. His gaze swept past the professionals and the cameras until it landed finally on the first row on 3 small girls, no longer so little, sitting proudly in matching dresses with floral embroidery. Lily was the tallest now, her posture straight and elegant, hands folded neatly in her lap like she was trying not to fidget. Scarlett leaned slightly forward, alert, her eyes shining with curiosity and pride. And Emma, tucked between them, clutched the corners of a sign they had made themselves, though it remained hidden for now. Beside them sat Haley, radiant and calm, her hand resting protectively on Emma's shoulder. When Michael saw them all there together, something inside him softened. He cleared his throat once and began to speak. "There was a time in my life," he said, his voice steady and even, "when I believed the world could be fixed through logic, data, and dollars. I believed that if I gave enough, built enough, funded enough, I could somehow heal the systems that had failed me and others like me. I thought my childhood was a scar I could outgrow. That success would make the pain smaller." He paused, looking briefly at his hands, then back at the audience. But pain doesn't shrink. It waits. It waits in silence in the background of even the loudest victories. And sometimes when you least expect it, it returns not to wound you again, but to show you where healing might finally begin. He glanced again at the front row, then continued. "I was sitting at a restaurant the night everything changed. I had just finished telling myself that I would never find meaning outside of work again. That I had done enough, that I had given everything I had to give. And then 3 small voices interrupted me, asking for a piece of bread." Some people in the audience leaned forward. Others stilled completely, knowing this was the part they had read about, the origin of what would soon be one of the most significant non-profit projects in the country. But what they didn't know was how close Michael had come to turning them away, to assuming they belonged to someone just out of sight, to believing the story couldn't possibly be as simple or as tragic as it was. "They were 5 years old," he said. "Hungry, cold, alone, and they weren't just asking for food. They were asking to be seen. Asking for a reason to believe that someone might finally say yes." He didn't need to tell the rest of the story in detail. It had been written, spoken, shared in headlines. But this wasn't a press release. This was the moment where it all came full circle. "We think of rescuing others as heroic," he said quietly. "But what I've learned is that real rescue, real family, goes both ways. I may have opened my home to them, but they opened something in me that had been locked for decades. They taught me that love is not a transaction. It's not earned by perfection. It's given freely in quiet moments, in bedtime stories, in school drop-offs, in whispered goodnights." His voice dropped to a softer register, no longer for the audience, but for the girls who were listening most closely. "They taught me that healing doesn't always come from institutions. Sometimes it starts at a kitchen table. Sometimes in pillow forts, sometimes in holding a hand during nightmares, and sometimes it begins with the simple act of staying. No matter what," he took a slow breath and gave a small, honest smile. "So today, I'm not here to launch a new tech firm or celebrate a milestone. I'm here to officially announce the opening of the Lily, Scarlett, and Emma Foundation, a national initiative dedicated to protecting, housing, and permanently supporting children and single mothers escaping domestic abuse. We're not here to offer temporary shelters. We're here to build permanent homes. We're not here to raise awareness. We're here to raise children, rebuild families, and restore futures." Applause erupted. Not the polite kind, but the kind that grows slowly with real feeling behind it. Cameras flashed. People rose to their feet, but Michael didn't move. He looked again to the front row where the girls had now stood, holding up the sign they had kept hidden until this moment. It was made from thick white poster board, the letters hand-painted in bright colors. "You became our bread. We love you, Dad." Michael laughed softly, tears already in his eyes. He stepped down from the stage and met them where they stood. Lily threw her arms around his waist. Scarlett pulled at his sleeve, tugging him down so she could whisper something in his ear. And Emma, who had once said nothing at all, took his hand in both of hers and said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Can we go home now, Daddy?" He didn't answer with words. He just held her tighter and nodded. The foundation launched with record-breaking donations that month. But what mattered most was never in the numbers. It was in the quiet mornings, the shared dinners, the soft footsteps in a hallway at night. The world would always need fixing. There would always be pain and loss and fear. But for Michael Willoughby and for 3 little girls who had once asked for a piece of bread, the story was no longer about survival. It was about belonging. And no one ever again would walk away. This story isn't just about rescue. It's about transformation, quiet resilience, and the kind of love that doesn't arrive with grand gestures, but grows slowly, stubbornly in the shadow of trauma. What makes it powerful is not that a wealthy man helped 3 broken children, but that he let himself be changed by them. Michael didn't just save the girls, they saved him, too, by awakening the part of him that had gone numb from success without connection. The real triumph here is not in the courtroom win, the foundation, or the new house. It's in the daily ordinary moments of choosing to stay. This ending doesn't wrap the pain in a bow or pretend the past didn't happen. Instead, it honors what healing truly looks like. Messy, patient, full of setbacks, but ultimately possible. In a world where many people pass by pain, this story reminds us that sometimes all it takes to change a life is to stop, listen, and say yes, only on Millionaire in Love.